Now, I know I haven't posted in a few years, specifically like 3, and it's been a really long time since I've made any other content. And also, you may have noticed the current content rebranding, but we're trying something a little bit newer. Hope you enjoy it. This is MMA for Idiots. We are going over the subject of how MMA went from human cockfighting to a legal sport. And this is your current host, Tristan Whitfield. Now, to begin, when most people think about mixed martial arts today, they probably picture the UFC, sold out arenas, championship belts, judges, doctors, weight classes, and highly trained athletes that spend their whole lives working on that specific talent. MMA looks like an established professional sport, but it did not start out that way. The story of MMA becoming legal is actually a story about controversy, politics, money, rule changes, and a sport that was almost destroyed before it even became mainstream and widely recognized as a sport. Now, to understand how MMA became legal, we have to go back to 1993. No, a long time ago. When the first Ultimate Fighting Championship was held in Denver, Colorado, the original idea behind the event was extremely simple. Bring fighters from different martial arts styles together and see which style works the best in a real fight. There were boxers, kickboxers, sumo wrestlers, karates, fighters, like savant fighters, and most famously, a relatively unknown Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter named Royce Gracie. And that name is going to stay pretty prevalent throughout history, as most of people that watch MMA still know and remember his name, and many gems have been continuously created with him in mind, using the same kind of style of jiu-jitsu he used in MMA. Now, as many of you know, the first UFC event looked very different from the UFC we know today. There were no weight classes, meaning much smaller fighters could potentially face someone dramatically heavier. Fighters did not have the modern 4-ounce MMA gloves. There were also no judges deciding fights based on points, and the fighters could potentially compete multiple times in a night. One of the most famous examples was Royce Gracie. He was not the biggest or strongest competitor, but he used Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to defeat much larger opponents. That became one of the most important early lessons in MMA. Technique could allow a smaller fighter to defeat someone who appeared physically superior. And that is where the controversy began. Now, most of you might be wondering, what about Pride? Well, yes, Pride was very large at the time, considering how small nearly every other MMA promotion was. And they were also one of the only ones you could get around. And they also had multiple ties to several gangs. And they were also ran halfway across the country from America. And chances are, if you're listening to this in English, you're probably not from Japan or anywhere in Asia for that matter to even really have that certain point of view. You might be from the UK, maybe Ireland. You could maybe even possibly be from Australia. But chances are you're most likely American. And it just wasn't very considerably relevant over here at the time. You did have some people that did a few martial arts that would go over there and train and then compete, but that was about it. It was still very small. Did come up with big names like Rampage Jackson, and multiple other people. But we're focusing mostly on Western civilization and European civilization. Now, whenever the UFC first started, people thought that it was mostly because of the politicians specifically pointing it out to be more so like cockfighting, but it was also partially on the UFC themselves. It was originally promoted as an extremely dangerous spectacle. The rules were intentionally limited, and promoters wanted viewers to believe they were watching something close to an unrestricted fight. Critics immediately attacked it as being too violent and dangerous. One of the most famous critics was Senator John McCain. In the 1990s, McCain became the biggest political opponent of the UFC. He famously described it as human cockfighting. He sent letters to governors across the country encouraging them to ban the events. And this wasn't just political talk. The UFC faced very serious restrictions. At one point, events were banned in dozens of states, and politicians were putting tremendous pressure on the athletic commissions and broadcasters. Pay-per-view companies became increasingly relevant to show UFC events. Cable providers did not want any of the controversy either. And it is actually very surprising to many people after the UFC 250 event over the summer that politicians were so against this, since now we have the president, and say what you will about him, that's up to you, but we have the president of the United States at the White House event, on the White House, watching a UFC event in a country where most states had it restricted. And it's honestly very surprising to me that it's came this far, but I can't say that I'm not glad. Now, the MMA had a bit of a problem. People were willing to watch it, but governments and major businesses and anybody with any kind of influence on business, they were very against it, and they would in fact go out of their way to try to suppress it. But the good news is this became one of the biggest turning points in MMA history. The sport had to change. The people running MMA realized saying there are almost no rules might get attention, but it wouldn't create a sustainable professional sport. So, regulators and promoters began introducing rules designed to protect fighters and make the sport easier to regulate. Weight classes were introduced so fighters could compete against opponents in their closer sizes. Rounds were limited by time, and judges were introduced. Certain techniques were banned, like for instance, for a while, the 6 to 12 was banned, and I believe the 12 to 6 was also banned for a little while. I don't think they even let them throw oblique kicks, and they have turned back on those a little bit now on those rules, but I mean, medical requirements became stricter too because people were getting CTE and basically becoming brain dead by the age of 40, and gloves became standard equipment. Eventually, the United Rules of Mixed Martial Arts created a much more consistent system that athletic commissions could regulate. One fun fact about it is that some techniques people associate with the old days of MMA were eventually banned because regulators wanted to make the sport easier to approve, and the more professional and standardized MMA became more prevalent, and it became more modern, and we see it more as the way it is today. It was also easier for the state athletic commissions to treat it like boxing or another regulated combat sport instead of an uncontrolled spectacle. But then came November of the year 2000. UFC 28 was held under unified rules framework and even represented a major step towards the modern MMA we currently recognize. And the UFC wasn't just trying to convince fans anymore. It was trying to convince governments that MMA could become professionally regulated. There was still another problem. The UFC was struggling financially. As most of you know, main two people that are known for helping start it out are people like Joe Rogan and the current president, Dana White. And in 2001, the company was purchased by Lorenzo Ferreira, Frank Ferreira III, and this is also around the time whenever Dana White became most popular and became known as the president of the UFC, as he was the main person in control of all aspects of the sport. And this did change the direction of the organization. Instead of simply trying to preserve the old UFC, the new owners pushed heavily for regulation and expansion. Their strategy was basically just like, if the states won't accept MMA, change the sport until the states are willing to accept it. This is where the political history becomes particularly interesting. MMA needed politicians and athletic commissions to approve events. It's very foreboding. But politicians also had to deal with public pressure. There were people who genuinely believed MMA was too dangerous to even exist. Others believed adults should be allowed to participate in a combat sport if proper safety regulations were in place. So legalization was not one giant decision made on one particular day. It happened gradually, state by state. And every time another state allowed MMA, the sport became a little bit more legitimate. Television companies became more comfortable with it, more sponsors became interested, more athletes entered the sport, and eventually MMA stopped looking like a bizarre underground spectacle and started looking like a legitimate professional sport. We have a few other side notes, fun facts, and ironic parts of the eventual progression of the UFC and MMA as a whole. And one of the funny parts was that the rules were created because politicians hated MMA, and politicians, they didn't just hate MMA because of the rules. They hated it just because they hated it. They saw it as human cockfighting. But then after they hated it, the UFC made a few adjustments and ended up getting it legalized because the politicians so openly hated it and said it, like, honestly, if they just didn't do anything, there's a chance that the UFC would have became less widespread. It wouldn't have became like international news. And early promoters essentially sold the idea that MMA was a fight with almost no restrictions, and today's UFC is almost the opposite. Weight classes, round, judge, medical examinations, fouls, referees, athletic commissions, and carefully established regulations. The sport had to become more organized in order to survive, and that transformation did not happen overnight. MMA went from being something politicians wanted banned to something governments actively regulated. Again, we had the president at UFC 250. And whether you think that it's a little bit out of pocket, some people even compared it to a movie where everything was set in the future and everybody became stupid. Say what you want about it, but the fact is that it became more governmentally approved, and it's very widely accepted in the current political eyes that everybody in the uh, political positions, everybody now is very more approving of it, specifically from the Conservative Party. Again, your politics or your opinion, but it's just the simple facts. They approve of it, and it did, in fact, help MMA progress as a sport. It became way more widespread now, especially because of UFC 250. And again, say what you want about Trump, but he did help promote the sport very much. Now, another very important note on the progression of the UFC and MMA as a whole is used to back in the 90s and a little bit in the early 2000s. The MMA audience wasn't watching it to see who the best MMA fighter was. It was trying to figure out what style of fighting was the best. And again, you had people like boxers, wrestlers, kickboxers, jiu-jitsu fighters, karate fighters, anybody like that. Nobody was really an MMA fighter. The closest you could get at that time was people like Fedor Emelianenko. Forgive me if I pronounced that incorrectly. It's a very long name. And ones like that had heavy ground and pound while also having standing striking and submissions. And that was why Fedor was so prevalently successful in Pride, because he had the full MMA kit that most people in modern MMA have. I would even say everybody, honestly. But the thing is that there really wasn't a perfect style. Boxers were good. As soon as they got taken to the ground, they were losing. They needed wrestling. Wrestlers, they couldn't get fights to the ground if they didn't have any striking at all, unless the other guy just sucked at defending takedowns and also sucked at striking. And kickboxers and any kind of strikers like that also need to learn some takedown defense if they intended to stay standing. And jiu-jitsu fighters needed to know how to take fights to the ground without making risky moves and also being able to finish the submissions. And so that realization created the modern MMA fighter, an athlete trained in multiple disciplines. So modern MMA fighters, they don't just train one martial art. Like, you can take anybody. You could take anybody from John Jones down to just people in the bottom ranks that nobody knows the name of. None of them strictly fight one martial art. All of them have more than one discipline. So myself, for instance, I do a bit of striking, but I'm primarily a grappler. I do a little bit of wrestling takedowns, jiu-jitsu submissions, and I also have some very basic kickboxing skills. And that is what a typical MMA fighter needs, because if you put a person in the MMA field, they only know boxing. Let's be realistic. They're getting either taken down or kicked in the face, or they're just like not going to see something crazy coming, and they're going to catch like some kind of like crazy, like just made up stuff and like get TKO'd with like a jumping spinning back kick or a like leaping oblique kick like John Jones throws. Same thing for wrestlers, same thing for strikers of any kind. They just don't have the full kit and they don't win. But nowadays, everybody has multiple disciplines, at least one kind of grappling and at least one kind of striking. And even people like Kamzat, who's primarily a wrestler and has some basic submissions that he is actually very good at, even him, he was able to stand and bang for with Sean Strickland for a little while, and that's very impressive in itself. Now, to finish up the video, as we are coming up on around 15 minutes, actually more than that, to finish up the video, it's just a simple look back and realize how far MMA as a whole has come. It doesn't matter if you only care about UFC, only care about one, whatever. MMA in itself has just come very, very far, because back in the day, the only places you could go to compete were places across the country to fight in things like Pride. And nowadays, it's very widely based around the world. You got the businesses set up primarily in America, and they're fighting in places like Abu Dhabi. They're fighting in places randomly in Europe. They're fighting in places in Asia, Russia, South America, everywhere around the world. It's very widespread. Unlike most sports that are only taking place in a certain country with certain teams from certain countries. It's people from all over the world just trying to see who's the best, and it has in fact come a very long way. And anybody that does MMA should they should feel very lucky that they got the opportunity to do that, because go back 30 years, you might not know what wrestling is, well, depending on the place you are in the world, and you might not know what kickboxing is. At the time, the only sports that people actually actively played, they were combat sports, where it's basically just boxing. But like I said, MMA has come a very long way, and that is the wrapped up history of how MMA went from being human cockfighting to becoming one of the biggest combat sports in the world. I believe the second biggest. And that is finishing up with the video. I apologize if my voice sounded very groggy and tired. I've been a little bit sick today, and allergies have been getting to me. But hopefully you enjoyed the video. Maybe subscribe, because it'd make me very happy. And that is all.